Chapter 6. Everything comes to those who wait. Mrs. Bird gave a groan as the sound of several voices raised in song, followed almost immediately by a sharp rat-a-tat-tat on the front door, echoed down the hall. "Not again," she said, putting down her sewing. "That's the 5th lot of carol singers in half an hour. I shall be glad when Christmas is finally here." "I'll go," said Mr. Brown grimly. "I should be careful what you say, Henry," warned Mrs. Brown. "Don't forget Paddington's out doing the same thing." Mr. Brown paused at the lounge door. "What?" he exclaimed. "Paddington's out carol singing? You don't mean to say you let him go?" "He seemed very keen on the idea," replied Mrs. Brown. "Jonathan and Judy are with him, so he should be all right." "I think they're collecting for some kind of party," broke in Mrs. Bird, coming to her rescue. "It's all rather secret." "Well, I hope whoever they are, they're not relying on Paddington's efforts for their Christmas entertainment," said Mr. Brown, feeling in his pocket. "Otherwise they're in for a pretty bleak time. Have you ever heard him sing?" "He went out by himself the other evening before Jonathan and Judy broke up for their holidays," said Mrs. Brown, "and he did quite well, considering." "2 bananas, a button, and some French francs," replied Mr. Brown, "and the bananas looked as if they'd seen better days." "I wouldn't say singing was exactly his strong point," agreed Mrs. Brown reluctantly, "but he's been practising quite hard up in his bedroom just lately." "There's no need to tell me that," remarked Mr. Brown feelingly. "He had me out of bed twice last night. I thought it was the blessed cats." He turned to go as once again the familiar strains of Good King Wenceslas filled the air, and then his face brightened as a sudden thought struck him. "I suppose," he said, "it is one way of getting our own back." Had they been able to overhear the last remark, not only Paddington, but both Jonathan and Judy would have been most upset. But fortunately, for the sake of peace in the Browns' household, they were much too far away at that moment, and in any case they had other, more important problems to occupy their minds. In particular, there was the matter of the amount they'd been able to collect from their evening's work. 35 pence, said Jonathan bitterly, as he shone his torch into the cardboard box which they'd been using for the takings. "A measly 35 pence." "It's not too bad," said Judy, "considering only 6 people have answered the door." "They can't all have been out," said Jonathan. "I wish we'd started our school holidays earlier. The trouble is, everyone's getting fed up by now. I reckon we've left it a bit late." "Perhaps we could say we're collecting for next Christmas," said Paddington, hopefully. It had been Paddington's idea to collect some money for the annual children's party at the hospital, and he was beginning to feel a bit guilty about the whole affair, especially as they'd set themselves a target of £20. Judy squeezed his paw. "I don't think they'd be very pleased if we said that," she confided. "Never mind, we'll think of something. We mustn't give up now." "Suppose we all separate," said Jonathan thoughtfully. "If we do that, we ought to collect 3 times as much. We needn't go far away," he added, reading Judy's thoughts. "In fact, we needn't really lose sight of each other. Paddington can have the torch, then he can signal if he wants anything." "All right," said Judy reluctantly. She glanced at the surrounding houses. "I'll take that one on the corner." "Bags I ever go at the one over there with the Christmas tree in the window," exclaimed Jonathan. "Which one are you going to do, Paddington?" Paddington considered the matter for a moment as he peered around all the houses. "I think I'd like to try that one over there," he announced, pointing towards an imposing-looking house standing slightly apart from the rest, and from which there came the distinct sounds of a party in full swing. "Come on, then," exclaimed Jonathan impatiently. "We shan't get anywhere if I don't make a start. We'll meet back here in half an hour." "Don't forget," called Judy, "if you get into any trouble, signal with the torch." "Send in an SOS," shouted Jonathan. 3 short flashes, then 3 long ones, then 3 short ones to follow. After testing his torch carefully in order to make sure it was working, Paddington hurried up the path towards the front door of the house he'd chosen, cleared his throat several times, and then knocked loudly on the front door. He wasn't the sort of bear who believed in taking too many chances, and with so much noise going on inside the house, he didn't want to knock after he'd sung his carol and then find no one had heard him. He opened his mouth and was about to launch forth into Hark the Herald Angels Sing when, to his surprise, the door suddenly opened and a lady stood framed in the light from the hall. "Oh, thank goodness you've come," she exclaimed. "I was beginning to get quite worried. I'm Mrs. Smith Cholmondeley," she added as she opened the door wider and motioned Paddington to enter. Paddington raised his hat politely as he stepped into the hall. "Thank you very much," he said. "I'm Paddington Brown." For some reason, the welcoming expression on Mrs. Smith Cholmondeley's face began to fade. "Have you done much waiting?" she asked. "Oh, no," said Paddington, looking round with interest. "I've only just got here." I mean, have you had any previous experience of waiting?" said Mrs. Smith Cholmondeley impatiently. Paddington considered the matter for a moment. "I had to wait for a bus the other day when Mrs. Bird took me out shopping," he said thoughtfully. Mrs. Smith Cholmondeley gave a rather high-pitched laugh. "Mr. Bridges at the agency said waiters were a bit short this year," she remarked, looking down at Paddington. "But I didn't think he meant, I thought he meant they were a job to get. That is..." Her voice trailed away. "Oh, well, at least they've sent someone," she continued brightly, avoiding Paddington's gaze. "We're having a little dinner party, and it's long past time to serve the first course. You'd better go straight to the kitchen and see Vladimir. He's beside himself." "Vladimir's beside himself?" exclaimed Paddington, looking more surprised. "He's the chef," explained Mrs. Smith Cholmondeley, "and if he doesn't get some help soon, I'm sure he'll do something nasty with his chopper. He was looking very gloomy the last time I saw him." She glanced down at Paddington's paw. "Let me take your torch. I'm sure you won't want that." "I think I'll keep it, if you don't mind," said Paddington firmly. "I may want to send some signals." "Just as you wish," said Mrs. Smith Cholmondeley, giving him a strange look. She led the way down a long corridor and then paused before a door at the end as she opened her handbag. "Here's your £10. My £10? Paddington's eyes nearly popped out of his head as he stared at the crisp new note in his paw. "That's what I usually pay," said Mrs. Smith Cholmondeley. "But I'd like you to start right away." "Thank you very much," said Paddington, still hardly able to believe his good fortune. £10 seemed a great deal of money to pay for a carol, even if it was nearly Christmas, and he hastily put the note into the secret compartment of his suitcase in case Mrs. Smith Cholmondeley changed her mind when she discovered he only knew one verse. As Paddington stood up, opened his mouth, and the first few notes of Hark the Herald Angels Sing ran through the hall, the colour seemed to drain from Mrs. Smith Cholmondeley's face. "That's all I need," she cried, putting her hands to her ears. "A singing waiter?" Paddington broke off in the middle of his opening chorus. "A singing waiter?" he repeated, looking most upset. "I'm not a singer. I'm a bear." Mrs. Smith Cholmondeley gave a shudder. "I can tell that," she said, opening the kitchen door, "and I shall certainly have something to say to Mr. Bridges about it in the morning. In the meantime, you better start earning your money. Everyone's absolutely ravenous." Without waiting for a reply, she pushed Paddington through the door and hastily closed it behind him. "Ha!" Paddington jumped as a figure in white overalls and a tall white hat rose from behind a pile of saucepans and advanced towards him. "So, you have come at last. Quick, off with your duffel coat and out with your arms." Paddington stood blinking in the strong white light of the kitchen, hardly able to believe his eyes, let alone his ears. In fact, he was so taken aback at the sudden strange turn of events that before he knew what was happening, he found his duffel coat had been removed and he was standing with his arms outstretched while the man in white overalls balanced a row of balls on each of them. "Quick, quick!" shouted Vladimir, snapping his fingers. "Get cracking with your mulligatonis!" "Cracking with my mulligatonis?" repeated Paddington carefully, finding his voice at last, but hardly daring to breathe in case any of the balls overbalanced. "The soup," said Vladimir impatiently. "It is getting cold, and on such short arms it is difficult to balance so much." Paddington blinked several times to make sure he wasn't dreaming, and then closed his eyes in order to count up to 10. But before he had time to reach even 2, he found himself being bundled back out of the kitchen, and when he opened them again, he was standing outside yet another door behind which he could hear the chatter of voices. "Quick!" hissed Vladimir, giving Paddington a firm push. "In here!" A buzz of excitement broke out in the room as Paddington entered, and several of the guests applauded.
"What a delightful idea, Mabel," said one lady. "Having a bear for a waiter. Trust you to think of something so unusual."
Mrs. Smith-Cholmondeley gave a sickly smile. "Oh, it wasn't really my idea," she said truthfully. "It just happened. But it makes a nice change." She eyed Paddington warily as he arrived at the table with his load of balls, but to her relief, apart from the fact he was breathing rather heavily down the neck of one of her guests, who happened to be in the way, there was little she could find any fault with. "I think we'd better give you a hand," she said hastily, when nothing happened. "We don't want any nasty accidents." "Oh, thank you very much," said Paddington gratefully, as one by one the various diners relieved him of his burden. "It's a bit difficult with paws." "Talking of paws," said the man Paddington had been standing behind, "you've got one of yours in my soup." "Oh, that's all right," said Paddington politely. "It isn't very hot." The man eyed the ball distastefully. "May I give you a tip?" he asked. "Oh, yes, please," said Paddington eagerly. Now he was getting used to the idea of being a waiter, he was beginning to enjoy himself, and after giving his paw a hasty lick in order to remove some soup which had accidentally overflowed, he held it out hopefully. "Don't carry quite so much next time," said the man sternly, as he helped himself to a roll. "Then it won't happen." Mrs. Smith-Cholmondeley gave a nervous giggle as she caught sight of the expression on Paddington's face. "I think I should see how Vladimir's getting on with the next course," she called out hastily. Paddington gave the man with the roll one final, long, hard stare, and then, after collecting several empty soup dishes, he made his way towards the door. The carol singing, not to mention the waiting, had made him feel more than usually hungry, and Mrs. Smith-Cholmondeley's words reminded him of the fact that, during his brief spell in the kitchen, he had noticed some very interesting smells coming from beneath the lids of Vladimir's saucepans. Although he still wasn't entirely sure what was happening, Paddington didn't want to run the risk of it all coming to an end before he'd had time to investigate the matter. What with one thing and another, serving the first course had taken rather longer than he'd expected, and he hurried back down the corridor as fast as his legs would carry him. To his surprise, when he got back to the kitchen, Vladimir was no longer dressed in white. His chef's hat was lying in a crumpled ball in the middle of the floor, and Vladimir himself was standing by the back door, clad in a black overcoat and muffler. "I may go back to Poland," he announced gloomily when he caught sight of Paddington. "Oh dear," said Paddington. "I hope nothing's wrong." "Everything is wrong," said Vladimir. He thumped his chest. "I, Vladimir, who have cooked for the crowned heads of Europe. I, who have had princes wait while I add the final touches to my creations. I, Vladimir, am reduced to this, waiting all the time. Waiting." He waved his hand disconsolately in the air. "My soup, she is cold. My entrecôtes, they are cold." "Your entrecôtes are cold," repeated Paddington, looking most upset. Vladimir nodded. "My beautiful steak, ruined." He pointed towards a grill laden with slowly congealing pieces of meat which stood on a nearby table. "I had to take them from the stove, or they would have been burnt to cinder." He reached out and clasped Paddington's paw. "They are yours, my friend. In the saucepans you will find the vegetables. You may serve it as you see fit. I, Vladimir, no longer care. Goodbye, my friend, and good luck." Worn out by his long speech, Vladimir paused by the back door, waved his hand dramatically in the air, and then disappeared from view, leaving Paddington rooted to the spot in astonishment. But if Paddington was upset by the sight of Vladimir's sudden departure, Mrs. Smith-Cholmondeley looked even more upset when some while later she caught sight of her steak. By the time he'd got round to serving all the various vegetables and carried all the plates into the dining room, things had gone from bad to worse. Even putting some of the pieces of steak in an electric toaster hadn't helped matters, particularly as several of them had popped out and fallen on the floor before he'd had a chance to catch them. Looking at his offering, Paddington had to admit that he didn't really fancy it much himself, and he felt pleased he'd taken time off to have his own snack before serving the others.
"If there's anything wrong with the baked Alaska," hissed Mrs. Smith-Chumley,
endeavouring to glare at Paddington with one half of her face and smile at a guest with the other,
"I shall insist on Vladimir giving me my money back. Baked Alaska," she repeated through her teeth as she saw the look of surprise on Paddington's face, "is a special surprise for my guests, and I want it to be absolutely perfect."
If Paddington's spirits sank as he made his way slowly back down the corridor towards the kitchen, they fell still more during the next few minutes as he peered hopefully at first one cookery book and then another. Although Mrs. Smith-Chumley had only spoken of asking the chef for his money back, he had a nasty feeling that when it came down to it and she found Vladimir had disappeared, his own £10 might not be too safe. Mrs. Smith-Chumley had a large collection of cookery books from many different parts of the world, but not one of them so much as mentioned the dish he was looking for. It was as he closed the last of the books that Paddington caught sight of a nearby low-hanging shelf which he hadn't noticed before, and as he did so he gave a sudden start. For there, right in front of his eyes, was a row of tins, one of which was labelled with the very words he'd been looking for. Hardly daring to close his eyes in case the tin disappeared, Paddington spent the next few minutes hastily making his preparations. First he turned the knob over the oven to read high. Then he looked around for a suitable dish. After carefully checking the thermometer in order to make sure the oven was hot enough, he emptied the contents of the tin into the dish and placed it inside the cooker. Normally, the only thing Paddington had against cooking was the amount of time it took for anything to happen. But on this occasion, he hadn't long to wait. In fact, he'd hardly had time to settle down in his suitcase and make himself comfortable before several whiffs of black smoke rose from the cooker, and the pleased expression on his face was rapidly replaced by a look of alarm as a most unappetizing smell began to fill the kitchen. Hurrying across the room, he tore open the oven door, only to stagger back as a cloud of thick black smoke poured out. Holding his nose with one paw, he picked up his torch with the other and peered mournfully at the contents of the baking dish as it sizzled and bubbled inside the oven. Paddington was a hopeful bear at heart. But although Mrs. Smith-Chumley had definitely said she wanted to surprise her guests, he couldn't help feeling, as he trundled a trolley laden with portions of his sweet down the corridor some while later, that his efforts might prove rather more than she'd bargained for. Giving vent to a deep sigh, he took a firm grip of his torch as he tapped on the dining-room door. Jonathan had told him to send out a distress signal if he was in trouble, and he had a nasty idea in the back of his mind that the moment to take his advice was not too far away. Mr. Brown stared at Paddington as if he could hardly believe his eyes. "Do you mean to say," he exclaimed, "that you actually served this Mrs. Smith-Chumley baked elastic?" Paddington nodded unhappily. "I found some rubber bands in a tin, Mr. Brown," he explained.
"He didn't realise Mrs. Smith-Chumley said baked Alaska," said Judy. "That's a sort of ice cream dish cooked in the oven."
"It was just after that he sent out his SOS," added Jonathan.
"I'm not surprised," exclaimed Mrs. Bird. "It's a wonder some of the guests didn't send one as well."
"They were jolly nice about it all," said Judy. "When the real waiter turned up and they discovered Paddington had really only come to sing a carol, they made us all stay." "He'd met Vladimir on the way too," added Jonathan. "Vladimir?" echoed Mr. Brown. He was rapidly losing track of the conversation. "Who's Vladimir?"
"The chef," explained Judy. "When he discovered the mistake, he came back after all, and he made some real baked Alaska so everyone was happy."
"We sang some carols afterwards," said Jonathan, "and we collected over £5. That means we've nearly reached our target." Judy gave a sigh.
"The baked Alaska was super," she said dreamily. "I could eat some more."
"So could I," agreed Jonathan. Paddington licked his lips. "I expect I could make you some if you like, Mr. Brown," he exclaimed.
"Not in my kitchen," said Mrs. Bird sternly. "I'm not having any young bear's elastic baked in my oven." She paused at the door. "Mind you," she added casually, "as it happens, we were having some ice cream for supper." "I must say, it sounds rather nice," said Mrs. Brown. Mr. Brown stroked his moustache thoughtfully. "I could toy with some myself," he agreed. "How about you, Paddington?" Paddington considered the matter for a moment. If one thing stood out above all others in his mind from the evening's adventure, it was the memory of Vladimir's baked Alaska, and he felt sure that an Alaska baked by Mrs. Bird would be nicer still. The Browns' housekeeper looked unusually pink about the ears as she raised her hands at the noisy approval which greeted Paddington as he gave voice to his thoughts. "Compliments are always nice," she said, "especially genuine ones. But if you ask me," she continued, pausing at the door, "Bear's compliments are the nicest ones of all, and they certainly deserve the biggest helpings."